One day, when no one expected it, the state of Kairon declared the beginning of a holy war. The human monasteries from Ifan participated in that fight. They were black-eyed and had extraordinary physical abilities. There were also the witches of Temfei. They summoned beasts and skillfully used spells. That event led to complete chaos on Earth. It seemed that everything in that world had broken down. A true saint who is beyond time received the blessing of the gods. His body did not age and his beauty did not fade. Then the great priest of Kairon declared publicly that only the believers of the country had received the sacred power of the gods. And the proof of this, according to him, was fire. He called upon the breath of the gods to carry out their judgment on the pagans. The man was kneeling. The master was telling him that he highly appreciated the fact that he had put the human monsters from Ifan to fight. He asked if he knew the one people called the divine mace, the most powerful weapon of Kairon. He wondered why the warrior could not stand against the witches of Temfei. He ordered Merklat to answer. Unlike the human monsters, who relied only on their physical strength and madly rushed into attack, the witches, each possessing a separate type of ability, went on the run, and then hid in all corners of Temfei. The warrior said that now it was not so easy to find each of them with shelter. The gentleman asked if Merklat had heard of the Great Witch. That was the name given to the chief of them. She had the ability to control animals, and also turn good souls into true evil. The question of why she did not interest the warrior hung in the air. The knight looked up and asked whether the master himself wanted it. An order was given to find that witch with eyes as red as blood, in order to cut off her head and cut her body into pieces. Merklat also had to be careful. There were rumors that just one look from her red eyes could captivate, and therefore the master did not want to lose God's faithful servant because of some witch. The sword pierced the dirty body and was stained with scarlet blood. The crows were sitting on the branches of tall trees. The knight approached from behind and called out to Mr. Merklat. The subordinate reported that all the witches in the area had been checked, but no one with red eyes had been found. The knight assumed that the cunning creature had hidden somewhere like a nasty rat, and was keeping quiet. He was surprised that these witches had never trained but hid so well. Therefore, he assumed the assistance of the great witch's power. Merklat called to go further. The assistant asked where their next path lay. The crows on the branches cried out. The knight was going to go southwest, a cave hidden from prying eyes in a crevice of a rock. Someone inside asked if it was really possible to be here. In the depths there was a red-haired woman. She said that she had heard that all the witches in the neighboring valley had been burned alive. The brunette was deeper in the darkness. She wondered if her interlocutor believed her. Her red eyes flashed from the darkness. She confirmed. But the girl was grabbed tightly by the hand, and they dragged her away from that cave into the light. She couldn't keep up and asked to wait. The imperious lady asked how many times she had to be told not to make things up. But the redhead was afraid that Vienna would betray them and go against them. But she was sure that such a thing would never happen, because the Great Witch, in her opinion, was not like that. The knight in armor swung his sword in a skillful hand. Scarlet blood sprayed in all directions. The redhead's face was also stained with the blood of the fallen victim. She became frightened and timid, froze in place. Soon the bloody weapon was pointed at her throat. The girl was making inarticulate sounds. Her body was shaking. Clear blue eyes flashed through the visor. The knight asked coldly and menacingly where they were coming from. Tears rolled from the redhead's eyes. She ran as fast as she could to warn the others. But what the girl saw in the village brought her to complete despair. Knights were killing women in the streets. There were cries of begging for salvation. There was a sound from behind. The knight was approaching the redhead. Her face twisted and she began to laugh hysterically. But at the same time, tears were pouring from her eyes. It turned out that the Great Witch had abandoned them. The sword was already raised mercilessly over the girl's head. A scream. Merklat gave the order to check everyone's eyes, and to immediately kill those whose eyes were not red. Soon one young knight called out to the gentleman about Merklat. He was holding a young lady with red eyes by the hair. The girl did have red eyes. Long chestnut hair framed her thin face, and her pink lips were cracked and sore. Merklat looked with pity at the young, defenseless, very fragile creature. But then he suddenly remembered the gentleman's words asking him to be careful, that supposedly one look into the red eyes could carry him away. Suddenly a blue glow appeared between them. The witch's hands were tied behind her back and she was being held by the younger knight. Merklat put the tip to the girl's throat. He looked her straight in the eyes. He said, gritting his teeth, that he had found the red-eyed witch. Snowy winter. Rave Fortress on the border of Kairon. Timfei's outskirts. A dungeon with prisoner cells. The gates are raised and the doors are wide open. A corridor. The tip of the metal was heating on the hot coals. A woman's scream was heard. A scream of pain. Night fell upon the earth. The stars covered the sky completely. It seemed as if everything was asleep. The gentleman glanced through the papers. He asked the knight if it seemed strange that the great witch had been captured so easily, and then he asked if there was anything strange about that person. The speaker said that so far they had not managed to find anything like that. He was advised not to relax and be careful. He was also interested in whether there was any news from the temple. The knight replied that a man should arrive at dawn who would take the witch to the capital. At this point, the speaker was released. But he finally decided to tell what he saw. That on the day they found the cave where the witches were hiding, the great witch was laughing, looking at her fellow tribesmen burning. The gentleman thought that it was on that day that the young lady with red eyes was captured. She wanted to tell them something, but she was tied up and taken to prison. Now it was unclear what the witch had planned. A bright light was pouring through the window. A muscular man naked to the waist was putting on a shirt. The brunette who entered called out to Mr. Mechlart. He asked in surprise what had been going on since the morning. The speaker asked for forgiveness. It seemed to him that it was worth going out. Several carts were standing at the gate. There was also a detachment of knights. The gentleman who arrived asked if they had seen this. He was holding a paper in his hands. It was a document with an official seal, namely permission from the great priest himself. They asked not to worry, assuring that there should be no problems. The gentleman also came out into the yard after the servants and asked what all the fuss was about. The guest had a strange appearance. There was a mask on his face. He bowed moderately, greeting the inquisitor. He introduced himself by the name of Pepin Toth. He handed over the document. After reading it, it became clear that there was an order to take the great witch to the capital and execute her. The same document placed all responsibility for the transportation on Dr. Pepin Toth. The dogs howled and barked, spraying saliva. The knight led the witch out of the dungeon. Her hands were shackled. The young creature looked fragile and frightened. Her red eyes were sad. The inquisitor looked over his shoulder. He angrily asked who dared to remove the bandage from the witch's head. The knight replied that a man named Pepin had expressed a desire to look at her red eyes. The visitor was surprised that it was the great witch. Such a dirty and low creature. The girl was doing something with her hands. A hissing sound came from her mouth. Suddenly a bright red glow appeared. All the dogs broke loose from their leashes. One of them knocked down the knight holding the witch. He dropped the chain. The girl took advantage of the moment and began to run away. A cry was heard calling for her to be caught. The inquisitor was about to grab his sword. He considered her attempt to escape stupid, but Mr. Pepin stopped him. He asked him not to harm the witch. The girl ran closer to them instead of trying to hide. At some point, the knight, who had recovered, grabbed her by the shoulder. The young lady said that she could help them destroy the Vedam. The Lord Inquisitor was surprised by her words. A rude question was asked about what nonsense she was talking. The prisoner asked Mr. Mechlart for forgiveness, but she was roughly grabbed by the shoulder. The knight, rattling his heavy chain, ordered her to follow him. The gentleman asked her to wait. He quoted her words, and asked why he should believe her. Everyone nearby was surprised. The guest from the capital, too. The red-eyed girl turned around. She shouted over her shoulder, "Le Gavin!" The knight continued to push the prisoner away. The girl could be sent there to check people. The inquisitor asked his assistant how far it was from here to the place indicated by the witch. She answered that one day would be enough for the round trip. An order was given to send reconnaissance there. The knight accepted the order without question. The gentleman gave the paper to the guest. He ordered the people to be lined up and the witch to be locked up. The prisoner's transfer was postponed until an investigation was carried out. Pepin was indignant. The young lady being led back to the dungeon by the knight looked back. She looked pitifully with her blood-red eyes. Her skin was covered with scars. Shortly after, Mechlart sat at the head of the table. Two men in red robes arrived to discuss pressing issues. It was surprising that the gentleman could actually believe that devil. It seemed that the witch just wanted to save her own skin. He asked the gentleman not to fall for such tricks. The second supported the rightness of the priest Brown. It was believed that even if the witch knew a lot, she could not be left alive. Otherwise, something unpredictable could happen. The knight leaned over Mr. Mechlart and reminded him that the information about the shelter turned out to be true. They asked about evidence. The priest admitted that some could already be under the influence of that daring witch. The bag was placed on the floor. Something round was taken out of it and placed on the table. And then the question was asked whether that was enough. The priest's face distorted. The gentleman, squinting his eyes, said that it took 3 years to completely exterminate the human monsters of Ifon. He was convinced that the longer the war lasted, the more losses the army and the state suffered. Meklart said that he would change his mind if someone suggested some effective way to end the war as soon as possible. He said that if this was not to the liking of the priests, then they could personally go to the front and take part in the battles. Father Brown screamed. He was indignant that it was unacceptable to leave the witch alive because of this. Meklart agreed that he was right. Therefore, he asked the doctor to tell the great priest that he needed time to determine what benefit could this witch bring them. The priests were indignant and against it. Mr. Pepin replied that in that case something was needed that could convince. The Inquisitor said 6 months. He was going to burn half of Temfe to the ground. He asked if that was enough. The corridor of the dungeon. Massive iron chains raised iron bars at the entrance. The girl was sitting on the floor of the cell. Her eyes were blindfolded and her skinny hands were shackled. A tiny mouse approached a pair of thin female hands. Squeaking thinly, the animal was not at all afraid of the human's proximity. The cell doors creaked. A shadow fell on the floor and walls. They ordered the girl to come out. The guard's hand in a leather glove roughly grabbed the prisoner by the forearm and abruptly lifted her fragile body. The girl involuntarily gasped in pain. The knight dragged the witch along the corridor. He asked the elder where to take her. The girl didn't know who was in front of her. Her eyes were covered with a thick bandage. A foot in a heavy leather boot took a step towards her. It was Meklart himself. He declared that he would personally take the prisoner. The gentleman sat on the edge of the table. In front of him stood a captive girl in chains. He asked if she knew why she was here. He said that in Stein there was only half of the amount that the girl had told them when indicating the place. Meklart assumed that the prisoner was simply tired of informing on witches. Or he assumed that she was trying to help her own, albeit belatedly. The girl replied that if she had wanted to help those witches, she would not have reported them at all. The Inquisitor narrowed his eyes. He saw that the girl had clenched her fists, and he asked her to take 5 steps forward. The prisoner obeyed meekly. Rattling her chains, she approached the Inquisitor. Meklart tore the blindfold from her eyes with a sharp movement. Leaning over her, he menacingly asked where the other shelter was. The young lady looked at the gentleman with surprise and fear. Her huge eyes, which took up half her face and were unusually red. In 6 months, half of the witches of Temfe were burned. The map on the wall had marks of the places where the witches were caught. The girl wondered how long it would take to exterminate the rest of them. The prisoner walked up to the map and pointed to a spot on it. According to her, it was the next shelter. "Vienna!" the Inquisitor said. The girl turned around at the name. There was fear in her eyes. From the reaction, the gentleman assumed that this was her witch name. He said that witches screamed this name, calling upon her many times, dying in the blue tribe of the Inquisition. The girl thought to herself that for the last 6 months Meklart had only received information from her about the witch's whereabouts, but he had never looked her in the eye. The witch asked herself why the Inquisitor was trying to find out her name right now. She stood under the wall with a map. She said that her name was unnecessary information for the gentleman. Meklart placed his hand on a section of the map and asked if the next place was Glada Gorge. She replied that there was a shelter not far from the cliff. The girl believed that those who had taken refuge in Stein had probably gone that way. The Inquisitor said that the witches' habits should change in 6 months, and they, having a head on their shoulders, will not move along the old routes. But Vienna considered them stupid creatures, subordinate to the devil. Meklart asked what if they didn't find anyone again, like in Stein. He informed her that then her denunciations would no longer make sense. The heavy chain clanked. The words of denial resounded loudly. The girl insisted that they definitely should be there. Vienna took a step but got tangled in the chain. She screamed and began to fall on the Inquisitor. He pushed the witch away from him. He asked in a cold tone how she could be so confident in her information. Meklart looked at the frail prisoner, and he supposed that she might have some way of getting news, even while in the dungeon. The Inquisitor also suggested the possibility that it would never be possible to exterminate all the witches, no matter how much they were hunted, as long as the main one of them was alive. The girl bit her lip. She assured me that if I did as I was told, they would be able to destroy an entire tribe of witches. The prisoner assumed that one day the moment would come when the blue fire would burn her to ashes. She stated that, however, she did not want to die now. The Inquisitor promised that her wish would definitely come true. Turning his head to the side, he ordered her to come in. The master ordered the intern to take the witch to the room. He obeyed the order without question. The prisoner being led away looked over her shoulder and called for the inquisitor. She was surprised that Meklart ordered her to be taken to a room, not a cell. She struggled and asked the guard where she was being taken. But then she saw the door. The witch peered through the crack with her red eye. There, a pale brunette was removing a protective mask from his face. Mr. Pepin declared that he was waiting for the Great Witch. Opening the door, the guard roughly pushed the witch forward. She looked around with wide eyes until her gaze met a familiar face. The girl's eyebrows rose in surprise and her gaze became tense. She could not understand what this man was doing in this place. Fiona looked towards the exit, but the door was already locked. Dr. Pepin chuckled behind his hand. He called his subordinate's reaction strange. As he approached the leather briefcase, he noted that he had been responsible for the witch's treatment for 6 months. It seemed to him that during this time they had become a little closer. Surgical instruments lay on the fabric at the side of the suitcase. Looking at them, the girl again thought with disgust that the treatment was just a pretext. In a quiet voice, Fiona asked why the doctor had not come to the prison cell as usual. He smiled slightly. Looking at the witch's bloody robe, the man replied that, according to the inquisitor, her leg was injured. He suggested starting with treatment. The girl's face expressed frustration and slight fear. Her plump lips were pouting as if she was trying to hide her displeasure. The prisoner walked slowly towards Dr. Pepin. With her shackled hands, she lifted her robe to show the wound on her leg. The man sat down, carefully examining the injury. The girl, avoiding his gaze, turned her head away and noticed a large container of bathing water. The doctor rubbed his chin thoughtfully and said that it was much more serious than expected. Blood and pus hid the wound itself. Smiling like a lunatic, the man said that they would have to wash the area. After his words, Vienna suddenly plopped down into a wide container of warm water. The witch coughed as she awkwardly tried to stand up. Her clothes and long hair were soaking wet. Suddenly, Dr. Pepin grabbed the witch's leg roughly and pulled her towards him. He confidently assured her that he would heal the wound as always. With a sly grin, the man said that the pain the head witch deemed necessary for healing. Then he pressed his thumb hard against the wound. Vienna's scarlet eyes filled with pain, and she couldn't bear it any longer and screamed. It seemed as if every corner of her body was filled with unbearable suffering. Ignoring the prisoner's pain, the doctor said that the guards in the dungeon were often changed. Everyone was afraid that she might use her charms on them. The girl struggled to free herself. The man mercilessly added that she was entirely to blame for beating the guards. Dr. Pepin continued to hold the witch's wounded leg tightly, preventing her from moving. Although she was shackled, she still continued to try to break free. Suddenly, he pressed hard on the open wound again. Vienna screamed in pain, jerked and accidentally touched the sacred cross hanging around his neck. The man froze, stunned, his gaze full of amazement. The witch lying in the water looked at him with a face full of despair, begging for mercy. Dr. Pepin looked the captive up and down and laughed mockingly. Pain and despair immediately froze in her eyes, filling them with tears. The man stared at Vienna like a madman. He said that she had managed to charm him with her red eyes after all. The head witch remembered the moment of the conversation with the inquisitor. He said that Stein had only half of the number she had named. The girl assumed that she deserved this treatment because she had not reported enough witches. Suddenly, an even more frightening thought occurred to her. Vienna thought they were getting rid of her, considering her useless. But suddenly the doctor pounced on her, breathing heavily. Fighting for her life, the witch knocked his hand away and tried to grab at least some kind of surgical scalpel. Before she could grab the scalpel, someone kicked the man. Pepin fell, looking at the inquisitor in bewilderment, his gaze stern. Trying to justify himself, the doctor stuttered and asked when the man had managed to enter the room. The man only sharply and sternly ordered him to get out. The surprised brunette froze with his mouth slightly open. He couldn't believe that he had heard such words addressed to him. Unable to tolerate the doctor's slowness, the inquisitor growled again. With an even more threatening voice, he ordered the immediate exit of the room. The man said that henceforth the treatment of the Great Witch would be carried out in the morning at 11 o'clock. He added that he would be present at everything. Hope appeared in Vienne's eyes, but Pepin continued to pester the blonde. He angrily asked why he had to repeat the same thing 3 times. Realizing that the inquisitor was at his limit, the doctor quickly stood up. Putting down his instruments, he headed for the exit. Pepin took hold of the door handle, but before he left, he turned around once more. His voice was quieter, and after a slight hesitation, he apologized guiltily. Lost in thought, the girl felt horror. She did not know whether the Inquisitor had seen her attempt to grab the scalpel, or whether everything had gone unnoticed. The witch pressed her lips together nervously, scolding herself for her haste. At the same time, she knew that she just wanted to get out of this situation as quickly as possible. The man looked at the captive seriously and asked a question. He asked if she had bewitched Dr. Pepin with just one look. With despair in her voice, the girl began to deny everything. She tried to prove that she did not have and never had such power. The Inquisitor thought for a moment and came to a conclusion. He skeptically assumed that Dr. Pepin had attacked her for no apparent reason. Fianna looked down, considering the situation. She came to the conclusion that the healer's behavior was explained by the fact that she was a helpless woman. The Inquisitor frowned thoughtfully and looked down at the floor. Then he asked if the witch was sure she had not used her spells. The man couldn't understand her. Vienna, bracing her hands on the side of the tank, rose to her feet. Water was running in streams from her prison uniform and long hair. The head witch raised her head and looked at him with a challenge. In a light tone, she suggested that he check everything himself. The girl assured him that if there was some kind of sinister force in her eyes, he would certainly feel it. The Inquisitor angrily asked if the witch had really decided to bewitch him too. She thought that she had been reporting him for 6 months, but he still did not believe her. Vienna expressed fear that if her doubts continued to grow, the Inquisitor would stop listening to her and order her to be burned at the stake. She asked if the gentleman had ever fallen under her spell in the last 6 months, looking into his eyes. She also assumed that they were afraid of her attack. The Inquisitor asked again. He said that even a deity would reject her damned body. But it turned out that Pepin knew that he would come here soon. And if the witch's escort from the capital behaved like that with her, then there was a good reason for it. Meklart grabbed the girl by the hand. She screamed as she was lifted above the water. And a second later, the Inquisitor held her in his arms. He said that, wanting to know the reason he would keep her close. Having seated the prisoner, the master gave her a cloth to wipe her wet body. He said that now she would sleep here, that while he worked during the day, Vienna should be with him. He asked if any further explanations were necessary. The girl wondered why the gentleman was suddenly behaving like that. He answered what he had just said. The Inquisitor stated that he wanted to personally check whether the prisoner was really hiding a sinister power or not. They had seen each other no more than a dozen times in the last 6 months, and he hoped to understand this if she was nearby. He wondered if Vian had heard anything from Dr. Pepin, that the high priest would soon be arriving here to examine the captive. A few days later, the chains rattled. The guard led the Great Witch behind him. Having brought the girl to the door, the bandage was removed from her. She found herself in front of Meklart. The Inquisitor sat at the table. In his hands was a piece of paper covered with writing. He was deep in thought. The Great Priest himself intended to arrive soon, and he notified them in writing, sealing the paper with his seal. The news of the visit spread with incredible speed. Dr. Pepin's suggestion was accepted. Wash, cure, and tidy up the witch's appearance. The Inquisitor slapped his palm on the table. He ordered the girl to stand up straight. He wondered if she was the only witch with red eyes. The girl answered in the affirmative. Meklart asked if she could prove it. She answered in the negative. The gentleman said she was of no use. He asked if Vienna was really a witch. She confirmed it. The Inquisitor was surprised that the Great Witch had no power. The girl asked if his interrogation was over. Meklart wondered if she really had done nothing to bring the Great Priest here. Vienna recalled that she had spent the last 6 months chained in a dungeon. The Inquisitor believed that the witch could have bewitched the doctor and carried out her deeds. The girl insisted that she did not have such powers. The gentleman stood up. Coming closer, he took the shackles and lifted the captive. The Inquisitor pressed her hands against the wall. He asked what it was in that case. The man leaned over the witch, holding her shackled hands, looking at Vienna in amazement. The hero stammered that the scars were traces of animal bites. This was very unusual. Indeed, the horrible marks that crossed the thin white arms were not fresh. They had clearly appeared before Kieran's purification. The girl froze, staring at the man in shock. Fear was frozen in her huge, wide-open eyes. Vienna immediately hurried to look away. But the man kept asking where such terrible marks on the body of the Great Witch came from. Suddenly, he grabbed the frightened beauty by the neck and lifted her off the floor. The girl screamed sharply from pain and horror, and he brought his face close to her ear and began to speak quietly. The man told her that he had found very interesting notes in Stein. The papers stated that each season the witches dedicated more and more girls, but it was unclear what the new sacrifices were for. Despite the tightness in her throat, the witch knew the man was waiting for an answer. She quietly squeezed out that there was no reason, but he still wouldn't calm down. It was known that witches could control animals, and the hero assumed that the girls were sacrificed for this reason. And if that wasn't the reason, then it was worth finding out where those scars came from. The gentleman's blue eyes flashed coldly and narrowed with anger. Then Vienna spoke out of breath. She said that Tymphea had many forests and wild animals. That was where the scars came from. However, this answer did not satisfy the man. He leaned towards the witch, burning her with his gaze. The hero hissed angrily through his teeth that he would have to conduct an experiment. The girl groaned in fear. Vienna stammered that it was not like that at all, and if she could control animals, she would not obey him. Large tears rolled from the beautiful eyes of the beauty. Now she looked especially helpless and unhappy, and the man looked at her and thought. He saw that the girl's pupils and lips were a rare shade of red. This spoke of the aura of a great witch. After some hesitation, the gentleman slightly loosened his fingers, squeezing the girl's throat. Finally, she was able to breathe normally, and suddenly the man let go of her hand completely. Having lost her support, the beautiful witch collapsed to the floor without strength, and the gentleman turned to the stairs and called the butler. His loud cry cut through the sudden silence of the hall. The tall double door opened immediately. Behind it stood an elderly man, bowing respectfully. Then the master dryly ordered him to bring water for washing. He humbly hastened to carry out the order. The butler only cast an interested glance at the girl at the end. Backing away, he began to leave. Suddenly, someone pushed the elderly man aside. An authoritative voice demanded that he clear the way. A strong hand pushed aside the protesting butler. The unexpected guest jerked the handle and swung the door open. The beautiful witch, frozen in fear, and the imperious gentleman looked at the man who entered. It was Father Brown, and now he indignantly asked why the man kept a witch near him. The man's voice broke with anger. The gentleman grimaced with displeasure. Such an unceremonious intrusion could only be expected from a clergyman. However, the man explained that he simply wanted to understand what harm a witch could do. At this, the guest huffed indignantly, pointing at the girl with a finger trembling with rage. Brown said that she could not be kept in the office. A witch's place was in the dungeon. The guest even rushed to the master and began to prove that it was absolutely forbidden to remove the shackles. But the master only asked him to step aside. This shocked the priest. No one had ever used such a tone towards him before. He even asked again. The gentleman calmly replied that his servant had brought water. That is why he asked the guest to step aside. Having said this, the man headed towards the table, and Father Brown began to shout that this would not do. He explained that the witch should be handed over to the priests. After all, the man simply did not realize how dangerous she was. Then the master asked if the high priest simply wanted to examine the witch. After all, priests had no right to torture anyone, although it was quite possible that the priests were capable of something even worse. Saying this, the man rolled up his sleeves and began to wash his hands in a basin of water. Priest Brown began to object hotly. He said that priests are servants of God, and they can drive out demons with their prayers. Then the gentleman grinned and asked since when the priests had such abilities. After all, before they used boiling water or nails. Hearing these terrible words, the girl decided to raise her voice. Vienna tried to timidly address Inquisitor Maclart, and suddenly she saw a bright flash before her eyes. Her pupils narrowed to the size of a pinhead. The beautiful witch groaned and sank back down to the floor. She didn't understand why this was happening again at that moment. Everything blurred before her eyes. The voices of the master and the Inquisitor began to be heard from afar, as if through cotton wool. In despair, Vienna dropped her head onto her cuffed hands. She couldn't let this happen now. Meanwhile, the blonde gentleman coldly said that the priests, as always, should be busy with prayers, and not appeal to divine power. Seeing that the priest froze in indignation, the man did not deny himself the pleasure of pricking him, and advised him to pray more diligently. Brown couldn't stand it any longer. He turned red with anger and shouted, asking what the owner meant by this. The host's silence inflamed him even more. The guest clenched his fists, burning with anger. A moment later, he pushed the table with a sharp movement. Brown screamed that there was a limit to everything, and the master should not boast of sacred power. The bowl standing on the table flew to the floor from the strong impact. Water splashed around. The owner looked at all this in amazement, and then his cold blue eyes widened in surprise. The man noticed that most of the water had landed on the beautiful witch, and now Vienna was soaking wet. Inquisitor Maclart and the priest looked at the girl. The guest even opened his mouth in surprise, and Vienna lifted her wet face and looked at the master. A muffled moan escaped her lips. Suddenly the girl closed her eyes. Tears mixed with water rolled down her cheeks. She understood that everything was starting again. A moment later, she was already falling unconscious on her side. Seeing this, the gentleman rushed towards her. He ran up to the fallen girl and knelt down next to her. Holding out his hand, the man called out to Vienna, and she suddenly opened her eyes. And now they were bright red. Now the girl looked more like a strange animal than a human. With difficulty coming to her senses, the girl thought that her life was terrible. And then she suddenly saw an unusual mouse with scarlet eyes. She was gnawing on a delicious red apple. Vienna felt a terrible hunger, took the apple and brought it to her lips. Taking a bite, she bitterly recalled the life of her mother and her mother. Both of them were unhappy, and now the beautiful witch was repeating their fate. With difficulty, the girl sat up and looked around. Vienna saw that she was in a semi-dark cave. She rose to her feet and peered into the darkness. The mouse, who had been eating the apple, also jumped up. The little animal rushed towards the dark hole in the wall. The girl thought that the mouse was heading towards the underground passage and decided to watch the rodent. Suddenly, the little animal raised its head and became alert. Vienna listened. Someone's voice asked if the witch had woken up. Two people were walking down the stone steps. One of them was Inquisitor McClar. The other was dressed in black, wearing a mask and holding a satchel. The man was a doctor, and now he was telling the Inquisitor that the beauty's body had fully recovered, but a full examination was needed. Vienna was dumbfounded by horror when she heard their conversation. She tried to order herself to wake up. After all this could not be happening in reality. And the mouse, as if sensing danger, suddenly became worried. The little animal spun around on the spot and rushed towards the dark abyss. The girl rushed after her, but she only managed to see a thin, long tail that disappeared into the darkness of the underground passage. Then the beautiful witch realized that her only salvation was to run away. Vienna ran to the hole after the mouse. At some point, a boulder blocked her path, but there was some free space above it. Then the girl began to climb up. Sharp stones painfully scratched her bare feet and beads of sweat ran down her face. And suddenly one of the stones moved under her fingers. The girl lost her balance and realized that she was falling backwards into the terrible dungeon. Along with her, the body of a small mouse rolled down from the boulder. Drops of blood were red on the indifferent gray stones. Suddenly, Vienna came to her senses with a sharp cry. Sitting up in bed, the girl had difficulty catching her breath. She covered herself with her hands and breathed heavily through her moans. The mysterious masked doctor and the Inquisitor looked at her silently. Finally, Inquisitor McClard asked the girl how she was feeling. However, it was already obvious that she was very ill. The doctor was already moving towards the bed on which the beautiful witch was sitting. But the owner stopped him, putting his hand on his shoulder. And Vienna was shaking with sobs, sitting on the bed with her hands over her face, the bed shaking under her. Here the Inquisitor noticed something and quickly approached. He picked up the blanket that covered the girl and began to examine it. Because of his back, the doctor could not see what had aroused such interest in the gentleman. He turned questioningly to the Inquisitor. He replied that there were bloodstains on the blanket that the witch was clutching. The men were puzzled. The doctor firmly stated that this could not be. After all, he had healed all the wounds of the beautiful witch. Then Inquisitor Maclart took Vienna's hand and turned it palm up. There were deep bleeding wounds on her thin fingers. The girl moaned as the man's fingers touched her skin. Every movement brought her unbearable pain. The witch tried to pull her hand away, but the owner looked at it carefully. He noticed that among the fresh wounds, old scars were also visible. Finally, the gentleman released Vienna's hand and walked away. After a moment of silence, he told the doctor that the examination was over and asked him to leave. Mr. Pepin shook his head indignantly. He even tried to object to the Inquisitor. However, he did not answer anything. He only slightly turned his head and sent the doctor a sideways glance with his icy blue eyes. He immediately became embarrassed and backed away. Stuttering, the doctor began to apologize and retreat to the door. When the doctor left, the owner came to the bed again and addressed Vienne. He noticed that the wounds looked like someone had bitten them. Then the girl tried to explain that she had been bitten by mice in the dungeon. And now she had simply opened up unhealed wounds. This answer did not satisfy the Inquisitor. The man noted skeptically that old wounds would not bleed so much. Vienna froze in fear. Ever since she had come to this place, she had managed to hide her scars and wounds. And Inquisitor Maclart continued to look at her with his icy eyes. He said that every season the witches sacrificed a girl, and now the man suggested that this was not a simple sacrifice. In fact, the blood of the victim was given to wild animals to drink. He realized that the blood was needed to control the animals, which meant that Vienna was the girl who was sacrificed. Hearing this, the girl turned pale. Trying to object, she screamed desperately. The beauty was filled with such despair that even the lantern at her head suddenly cracked. Glass fell down. Smoke poured out. She wanted nothing more than to disappear. But the Inquisitor still held her hand and looked at her expectantly. His eyes seemed to penetrate Vienna's soul. The man advised her to tell the whole truth. Then the girl quietly said that in fact animals are not controlled. It is just some kind of interaction. The gentleman slightly loosened the hand with which he was squeezing her fingers and asked her to continue speaking. The room was almost dark. Only the firelight from the fireplace illuminated their faces. Shadows thickened in the corners. Vienna explained that she simply felt the same as the animals that tasted her blood. However, this was of no use, since it all happened in a dream. Then Inquisitor Maclart noted that she had too many useless bites, and Vienna replied that they were simply unsuccessful attempts. After thinking, the man said that he understood everything, and her denunciations were based precisely on this ability to interact with animals. But the girl hotly denied this. The very idea of denunciations was offensive to her. However, the Inquisitor smiled skeptically. It was hard to believe that the witch could see through the eyes of animals, but did not take advantage of it. His gaze froze for a moment. The man was thinking intensely about something. Finally, he said thoughtfully that there was no one in the Glada Gorge. The girl's eyes widened in amazement. Vienna screamed loudly that this simply couldn't be happening, and the man mockingly replied that she spoke so confidently, as if she had seen it all with her own eyes. After a pause, he asked her to name the next region. This was how the girl could prove that she had not used witchcraft. Looking menacingly at the beautiful witch, the Inquisitor threatened her. A lie could be a death sentence for Vienna. In that case, all her reports would have to end, and end with her own terrible death at the stake. And then the girl felt like a baby again for a moment. Her own mother was leaning over her and strangling her with all her might. She could have died. Of course, her life was not wonderful, but it was not worth ending it with such an early death either. The girl lay on her back in a damp, dark cave, her own mother continuing to strangle her. Maddened, she wished the child death. Tears stood in the eyes of both the woman and her daughter. Two pairs of red eyes looked at each other. Two strong women tried to pull the madwoman away from her defenseless victim. The third one was in a hurry to take the little girl away from the cave. Holding Vienna's hand tightly, she urged her to leave as quickly as possible. The witch screamed after the girl that she had to die. Already at the entrance, the little girl looked back. There was sadness in her eyes. Vienna sat on the forest grass. In front of her stood the same woman who had led her out of the cave. She ordered her not to enter without permission. The question was asked if the girl understood. Covering her ears, Vienna realized that the day would come when she too would be locked inside. And then she will serve the witch tribe for the rest of her life, covered in dirt and smelling of blood. Now Vienna thought that despite her lousy life, at least she could meet death as she wished. The voice of the Inquisitor brought her back to reality. He demanded that the witch name the next place where her relatives were hiding. Tyron Hill! The young lady blurted out, almost shouting. She bowed her head, looking down. The Inquisitor stood before the prisoner, listening attentively to her. She reported that a family of witches, worshippers of the devil, lived in that place, and I wondered if they were alive. But then I began to reassure myself that in any case someone had to be hiding there. Maclart called loudly to the guard outside to tell the corporal to immediately get rid of all the mice that lived in the underground passage. Vienna looked at the Inquisitor with a pitiful look. He ordered it to be carried out, adding that not a single rodent should be left alive here. A carriage with golden decorations drove past a sunny lawn. Judging by its ornate decoration, they were carrying someone important and significant. The guy in the red cloak sat with a map in his hands. He said that in 10 days they would arrive at the border, where the Rave Fortress was located. He asked the great priest what was troubling him. The white-haired youth's face was hidden by a veil. Suddenly, for no apparent reason, the horse pulling the carriage reared up. Its loud neigh literally deafened the passengers. The priest became worried. His companion asked for forgiveness. He was going to go and check everything himself. Opening the doors, he looked out cautiously. A group of peasants stood with their heads bowed. They begged the high priest to turn the Lord's favor upon them. It seemed that these were the believers of the city that was supposed to be next on their way. And although the priest's arrival was kept secret, they somehow found out about it. The Great One said that nothing could be done. He assumed that this event could be a message from God, and he intended to come out to the people. The escort replied that the time spent here would delay their arrival in Raven by a whole week longer. The priest folded his thin-fingered hands in prayer. He said that he could not reject those who needed God. The assistant stuttered and apologized for thinking too narrowly, and he was going to go out to the crowd first to restore order. The priest followed him, and our heroine sat on the bed with her face buried in her knees. Her legs were shackled. A week ago, Maclart went on a witch hunt, but not to the hill of Tyren, but to the gorge of Glada. The Inquisitor declared that there was no one there. He insisted that if the witch's denunciations were not based on witchcraft, then he demanded that the next region be named to him. Now she realized that Maclart had tricked her. No one had been sent into that gorge in the first place. The hinges creaked. The door opened. The witch was welcomed. Dr. Pepin asked her if she had been happy living alone for a week. The girl perked up. The brunette was dreamily humming something to himself. He was taking leisurely steps towards the captive. She loudly called out to the Inquisitor. Viana informed the doctor that before the military campaign, no one was allowed to enter this room by order of Mr. Maclart. Mr. Pepin asked the witch not to worry about this. After all, today, behind him stood a gentleman of a higher position. The key flashed in the doctor's hands. Demonstrating it, he assured that the witch should be happy about it. Soon the shackles fell off the girl's leg. Pepin assured the prisoner that they were going for a walk. Vienna and the doctor walked for a long time across the open area. The girl wearily asked how much longer they had to go. Pepin looked slyly at the young witch. He ordered her not to be capricious, because the goal of the walk was already close. Soon the earth began to fall from under their feet. The girl was scared. They were standing on the edge of a pit. At the bottom lay a mountain of human bodies. The already thin face of the red-eyed witch grew longer. She asked herself why she was standing next to a cesspool of corpses. Vienna glanced at the doctor with apprehension. There was a wooden container next to the man. The girl was at a loss as to what to do. Pepin spoke so that she would not even think about escaping. He drew the witch's attention to the fact that there was open ground here, where she would be visible from everywhere. A deep, malicious laugh rang out. But the girl hadn't thought about anything like that. She was asking for an answer. Were all these bodies really witches? Vienna reminded them of the agreement that all witches, except her, would be immediately executed on the spot where they were found. The doctor silently took the container and poured liquid from it over the fragile girl's head, and then he dropped it. He said it slipped. The witch asked what they poured on her. Drops ran down her face, dripping from her beard and strands of hair. Pepin said that he had finally been granted permission to check. A beastly roar was heard in the bushes. The witch looked around warily at the sound. The doctor insisted that those sounds were nothing, since hungry predators often roamed the area. He reported that if medicinal water spilled on it attracted even a little bit with its smell, it would be quite easy to lure animals. The man asked the prisoner not to worry too much. After all, special preparations had been made just in case, and archers had been stationed around the perimeter. The doctor said that some blood would have to be spilled anyway. He believed that the predators might not have reacted to the cold blood. Pepin grinned evilly and asked how it was about the freshly spilled. Tears flowed like a stream down the girl's cheeks. Vienna suddenly compared Pepin's words with her conversation with the Inquisitor. Horror and despair were reflected in her eyes, but the hungry predators, baring their teeth and spraying saliva, inexorably approached the fragile girl. The witch attempted to escape, dragging a heavy chain behind her. The doctor shouted after her that the predators would catch her anyway, and it was not worth angering them. Pepin laughed, watching the picture, but he assured the girl that if she could endure it now, she would be very grateful to him in the future. Vienna ran as fast as she could. She knew that no beast in this world could harm her. They could only desire her, and having tasted her blood, they suppressed their aggression. But even knowing this, the girl tried to run away. And what truly frightened her was the cruel fate of the Great Witch. Vienna began to whine like a little girl. The fate of the Great Witch was repeated even in this place. The girl wondered if Maclart was going to use this power once it was confirmed. She couldn't tell about Pepin, but he would kill her the very moment the results of the experiment were confirmed. The girl assumed that she would then probably be burned at the stake. Her bare foot tripped over a small stone. With her hands in shackles, Vienna was unable to keep her balance. She fell to the ground. The predator was inexorably approaching her. The wolf grabbed the witch by the arm, clamping his jaws on her just above the wrist. Blood spurted. The moment the animal tasted Viana's blood, its eyes instantly turned red. The second wolf was also in a hurry to feast, to taste the living flesh of a weak victim already caught by his fellow. The girl whined from the realization of the inevitable. The predator made a final lunge. Its amber eyes were focused on its prey. Its mouth opened, revealing 2 rows of sharp teeth. Tears gushed from the witch's eyes. She thought that in the end even death would be lousy. But then suddenly the wolf running towards the witch let out a long howl. Blue flames enveloped his body. The red-eyed predator, having tasted blood, released its prey. It pressed itself to the ground and trembled with fear. A guttural roar was heard. Vienna glanced over her shoulder. A horse came into her sight. The Inquisitor sat on it, clutching the reins tightly. Dr. Pepin was taken aback by the surprise. He stammered and asked how Mr. McClard ended up here. The Inquisitor dismounted and replied that he should ask the respected doctor. He recalled that before leaving he had given the order to lock up the Great Witch, and now he was upset by what he had seen. Meanwhile, the wolf, struck by blue flame, writhed on the ground, breathing its last breath. The Inquisitor stared menacingly at Mr. Pepin, expecting him to answer for what he had done. The witch sat on the ground, not believing her eyes. The doctor smiled a crooked smile. Stuttering, he began to justify himself by saying that he was following the orders of the great priest. He asked to wait a second and began to rummage in his pockets. And having fished out a bundle from the depths, he handed it to the Inquisitor. This was the order of the high priest. The witch concluded that Maclart knew nothing about it at all. Pepin commented that the document stated that the high priest would arrive for a visit later than expected, and ordered that the witch's powers be tested in advance. Maclart looked down and thought that action had been taken faster than he had expected. Strong hands tore the high priest's letter in half with one jerk, tearing it. Pepin asked in fear what the Inquisitor had allowed himself to do. Blue eyes pierced the doctor coldly. Maclart asked angrily if the doctor had really staged this whole show based on just a piece of paper. The Lord Inquisitor reminded that Rave was his fortress, as was the Inquisition, which was subordinate only to him. Maclart stated that he personally did not care, and was not at all interested in who worshipped whom. However, he was not going to let his orders be disobeyed in his fortress. Dr. Pepin timidly asked for forgiveness, and promised to be more careful in the future. Maclart declared that this time he would pardon the impudent fellow at the expense of the torn letter. Having lost interest in the doctor, the gentleman turned his attention to the witch. He took her hands and helped her rise from the ground. He said that her legs were fine. He asked why she was sitting on the ground then. Vienna tried to stutter something. Turning his horse, Maclart gave the order to return to the fortress, and soon the trio left the scene as a group. But a predator lurked nearby in the bushes, having tasted the blood of the Great Witch. He remained unnoticed. His red eyes betrayed his connection with an unusual victim. Vienne's eyes were blindfolded again. The Inquisitor led her into the castle, holding her by the chain. He urged her to move faster. The girl screamed in pain. Blood came through the bandages. The bite wound was bleeding. She saw fire through the blindfold, and showing curiosity, she removed the blindfold with her hand in order to understand where she was. In the room with expensive furnishings, firewood was burning. A pleasant warmth was spreading throughout the room. Documents were scattered on the floor. The witch's bare foot stepped onto the soft carpet. The girl wondered where she was. Vianne squatted down and began to feel the carpet with her hands. The sensations delighted her. Maclart watched the antics. He wondered if the witch was so brave or just stupid. The girl raised her head and met the Inquisitor's gaze. She asked for forgiveness, confused and timid for not noticing the gentleman. The man asked her to forget, and he called Vienna closer. He himself settled down comfortably, sprawled on the sofa. He picked up the sheets and began to read them. The young witch stood obediently by while the Master Inquisitor read the document. When he finished, Maclart asked if the girl had been treated properly. The witch gasped and insisted that it had probably happened on the way here. She supposed that she might have disturbed the wound when she was pulled by the chains. The gentleman was surprised that her body bled so often, and he was surprised that she was still alive. Maclart ordered the witch to describe in detail the appearance of the beast that bit her hand. The girl assured that the gentleman should not have bothered to catch that animal. The wolf would have died soon after responding once anyway. The Inquisitor asked how Vianna knew this for sure. She replied that this kind of thing always happened. Otherwise, she would have simply gone crazy. After all, exchanging feelings with so many animals was very difficult. Blue Eyes stared at the girl. The Inquisitor said he didn't understand. If she couldn't control the beast, why did she give up her body? to be torn apart for a short one-time connection. Vienna assured that this was the only way to predict the threat that was approaching these lands. It could have been a great flood, an earthquake, or landslides that only animals knew about. Meklart suddenly remembered what the priests told him. They claimed that witches were so unfortunate that even natural disasters spared them. Vienna assured the master that he had no reason to worry. She didn't know the time, but a day or two and that wolf would be finished. Meklart replied that if the witch had not lied, she could live here for now. The witch was surprised because these were the personal chambers of the Inquisitor. Inquisitor assured that there was nothing else to do but to stay close and watch Vienna to make sure she responded. The girl asked why the gentleman needed to look at this. After all, the response could have arisen at any moment of the day or night. Meklart assured that in that case, Vienna should have stayed here until it arose. He said that the witch could try to escape as many times as she wanted, but she could not leave this room without permission. Vienna was sitting on the floor against the wall. Her hands were cuffed, so she was uncomfortable. She was sleepy. At some point, a floorboard creaked. This disturbed her slumber. An involuntary cry escaped. The Inquisitor was heading for the door. He had a cloak over his shoulder. Vienna asked if he was leaving. The answer was affirmative. Meklart said he would be gone for only a couple of hours. He hoped that nothing strange would happen to the girl during that period. The Inquisitor took hold of the door handle with determination. Soon he was striding down the corridor. The gentleman went out into the palace courtyard. Life was in full swing there. Everything was going on as usual. On the ground lay a pair of stretchers, covered with a white sheet. Fresh blood showed through it in scarlet spots. A week had passed since Meklart had settled the Great Witch in his chambers. The witch had not slept a single time. The Inquisitor asked himself the question, why? And as if he was answering himself, assuming that she was trying to avoid a response in this way. He opened the door. The woman sat tied to a chair. She screamed. The guard recognized the Inquisitor and greeted him. Meklart asked if this was the witch that Glada had captured in the gorge. The woman wept and begged for mercy. Tears were streaming down her cheeks. Her whole body was shaking. She assured that only the Great Witch was the only one who possessed the true witch power. The victim assured that she and the other witches were innocent. The master asked if by unique power she meant the response of wild animals. The sufferer's face brightened. She was surprised and glad that the gentleman already knew everything. He confirmed it. Meklart asked why only the Great Witch was capable of responding. The woman hiccuped nervously, and then she said that it was for the sake of predicting the end of the world. The Great Witch was a sacrifice in the name of finding the beast that would provoke the end of the world. Meklart confidently stated that he considered the topic of the end of the world to be nothing more than nonsense. And the woman told him that for a long time a legend had been passed from mouth to mouth among witches. Someday a beast was bound to appear that would bring this world to destruction, and in order to prevent this, the witch had to find that beast with the help of the response. Mr. Meklart asked how the witches were going to find that creature. The prisoner insisted that if the beast did not die after responding to the witch's call, it would mean that it was the incarnation of the devil, intertwined with the witch. The Inquisitor asked what would happen after the witches found that beast. The woman hesitated, choosing her words. She said that by killing the Great Witch who bound the soul to this beast, the end of the world could be prevented. The man summed up what he had heard. That in order to stop the end of the world, the witches gradually fed the animals with the blood of the red-eyed girl, and when the beast that survives appears, her fellow tribeswomen will kill her. Clenched fists betrayed nervous tension. The man, having lost his self-control, rushed to strangle the prisoner. He was more prepared that she had thought of all this herself, harboring a grudge against the Great Witch. Meklart assured that the Great Witch had been captured. Now she had no way of finding the beast, and soon she would be consigned to the flames after that. He asked if there was no one left to stop the end of the world. Looking at the guillotine, he told his assistant that there was no longer any point in keeping her alive. The Inquisitor ordered the guards to sort things out themselves. He turned to leave. The woman asked him to wait. The tied captive began to shout after them that there was another Great Witch. Meklart stopped dead in his tracks. His blue eyes narrowed in disbelief as he stared at the witch. He said that according to rumors, the Great Witch was alone, and he asked if the liar had really decided to feed him fairy tales again. The woman stuttered and denied. She said that the essence of the Great Witch was transmitted through blood. But not long ago, the mother of the Great Witch gave birth to another child, and few people knew about this yet. Meklart wondered that if it was inherited by blood, Then the mother must also have possessed the power. The witch, tied to a chair, was shaking all over. She insisted that having lost her gift, the red-eyed one's last duty was to leave descendants behind. The Inquisitor said that although the woman was a witch, she would hardly have been able to conceive on her own. And so the question arose as to who was the father. Tears rolled uncontrollably from the witch's eyes. Stammering, she told Maclart everything she knew. The words came with difficulty to her. The Inquisitor was clearly not ready to hear this. He rethought a lot of things, believing the witch's words. Old Witch said that it was impossible, and supposedly no one could know who exactly was the father of this child. The blood of a great witch is not suitable for everyone. Therefore, she must obtain the seed of different men until one of them gives birth to a child. The Inquisitor felt disgusted as he watched the witch grovel before him. He could partly understand Vienna's behavior. He had wondered before how the girl could leave her tribe so easily. It seemed that Vienna had easily severed all ties. But now, looking at the miserable fallen woman, the Inquisitor understood everything. This tribe did not deserve the sacrifice of the Great Witch. Now Maclart knew enough and needed no more information. He headed for the exit, ordering the executioner to finish the job. The witch tried to shout something after him, but the Inquisitor did not listen. As he left, he only heard groans and curses flying at his back. For a moment, the man felt sorry for Vienne. He even thought that it would be better for him not to know anything. The Inquisitor left the basement and headed towards his quarters. But only when he took hold of the door handle did Maclart hear someone calling. Turning around, he saw one of the guards. The man was clearly worried about something, but he did not dare to speak directly. The gentleman stopped and waited for the guard to approach. Only then did the Inquisitor inquire about the reason for the delay. The guard standing before him was desperately worried. His face was covered in large beads of sweat, and his eyes were feverishly shining. Finally, the man made up his mind. He asked how much longer the master was going to keep the witch in his castle. Such a question to the Grand Inquisitor was an unheard-of impudence. Therefore, it surprised Maclart quite a bit. He paused, raising his eyebrows haughtily. Then he asked the guard's purpose in asking this question. Then the man replied that the warriors no longer needed the services of the Great Witch. Her denunciations were not needed to cleanse Temfei. So it would be better if the Inquisitor took advantage of the opportunity after the visit of the High Priest. He would be able to return to the capital. After all, the other priests had been having endless conversations lately. Many believed that the Inquisitor was keeping the witch for personal purposes. Seeing Maclart's indignation, the guard immediately rushed to assure him of the soldier's loyalty. The warriors did not believe any of the gossip. However, many still did not understand why Inquisitor Maclart was willing to put up with gossip and backbiting because of a witch. This conversation was beginning to irritate the gentleman. His gaze was icy as he advised the guard not to rush to conclusions. After all, if the Inquisitor had sent the witch to the capital without being convinced of her abilities, it could have ended badly. There should be no mistake. The guard was confused. He did not understand the whole plan, but he obeyed his master and the Grand Inquisitor Maclar. And the owner firmly said that they were all just doing their job, and he advised them never to forget about their duty, giving in to emotions. Having finished the conversation, the man retired to his chambers. This day was very difficult and seemed endless, and now, wearily rubbing his face, he thought about what he had learned from the witch. It was also worth weighing every word of Vienna. She pointed to Glada Pass and Terran Hill for the last time. Both of these places turned out to be refugees. But this still did not give the Inquisitor any evidence. Merging with animals could have had nothing to do with it. The only animals Vienna could use in the dungeon were rats, which meant she could get information about a small area. However, the girl's knowledge extended to areas that the rats could not reach, which meant that she was hiding some other ability. All this had to be sorted out as soon as possible. After all, there wasn't much time left before the arrival of the Great Priest. Suddenly, Maclart remembered his own advice to the guard. He told the warrior to never forget his duty while being led by his emotions. All this was completely inopportune before the arrival of the Great Priest. The Lord Inquisitor was racking his brains, solving a difficult problem. As Inquisitor Maclart walked through the gallery, he noticed that the moon was full. This fact filled his soul with anxiety. The man opened the door and entered his chambers. There was a strange, tense silence. Maclart became wary. As he passed the table, he grabbed the sword lying on it and called out to Vienne. The girl did not respond. This was strange. And then the man noticed long strands of hair scattered across the carpet. Coming closer, he saw a beautiful witch. The girl was lying right on the carpet at his feet. The witch didn't move. and didn't even react to the sound of his heavy steps. Inquisitor Maclart frowned in alarm and came closer. Only then did he hear Vienna's quiet breathing and light snoring. A whole week passed, and finally the girl fell asleep right on the floor, despite the shackles and other inconveniences. Now she was fast asleep, her shackled hands tucked under her cheek. In her sleep, the witch's face was as beautiful and defenseless as a child's. Suddenly, a groan escaped her lips. Vienna clenched her teeth as if in pain. A moment later, her entire body was seized with a spasm. Without waking up, the girl arched her back and screamed. The Inquisitor looked at her, his brows furrowed sternly. He realized that he was seeing the beginning of the girl's merging with the animal. The man remembered asking Vienna about it. He was very interested in what it looked like and whether her sleep was different from usual. Then the girl said that merging with an animal can be easily determined. After all, the bite site begins to bleed. Remembering this, Maclart jumped up to the witch and grabbed her hand. With all his strength, he tore off the bandage covering the wound. The thin sheet spread under his fingers. White, tender skin was exposed. Among the old scars, a fresh wound stood out with bright scarlet blood. Now Inquisitor Maclart knew exactly what he was seeing. At that moment, right before his eyes, the fusion of the witch and the animal was taking place. The girl's body was thrashing at his feet. She was breathing heavily. Tears were streaming from her eyes. The man looked at her with wide eyes. It was hard for him to even imagine the torment the beautiful witch was experiencing at that moment. Maclart tried to imagine the exact number of scars that crisscrossed the girl's body. It was simply impossible to go through all of them so many times. Suddenly, something subtly changed. The Inquisitor became alert, sniffing the air. A strange sweetish smell appeared from somewhere in the chambers. It was a bit like the aroma of strong wine. This seemed to be another of the characteristic signs of the beginning of the merger. It was at this moment that the witch must have felt like an animal. Maclart leaned over Vianne, who was fast asleep. Her brows were furrowed and her arms and legs were twitching slightly. Large beads of sweat were visible on the girl's face. This could not be called a calm and serene sleep. And at this time the beautiful witch felt like a wild forest wolf. He flew swiftly through the forest thicket. The animal's eyes glowed with an angry scarlet fire. Drops of saliva fell from its open mouth with bared fangs. The wolf headed towards a clearing at the edge of the forest. There, on a fallen tree, a woodcutter sat alone in front of a fire. The wolf looked at him from behind a tree and rushed forward, his strong paws carrying his powerful body forward without restraint. Jumping out into the clearing, the wolf soared upward in a decisive rush. In a moment, he would inevitably sink his fangs into the throat of a defenseless man. And suddenly, a few centimeters before the target, his jump was interrupted. The blade of a short dagger pierced the beast's right side. A second later, it was all over. The beast lay lifeless on the ground. Its bared jaws could no longer harm anyone. With a fading gaze, the wolf saw the people surrounding him. The woodcutter standing in front leaned over and pulled his dagger out of his victim. At the same time, Vienna opened her eyes with a groan, her pupils unnaturally dilated, and tears streaming down her face. The girl pressed her hands to her face and moaned that she felt something terrible. But these were not her feelings, but the feelings of the beast that had merged with her. She was a beast that attacked a woodcutter, but she did not want to kill a man. That desire belonged to the wolf, not the witch. But feeling like a murderer was too scary. And now Vienna couldn't calm down. Inquisitor Maclart shook her by the shoulders, trying to bring her to her senses. But the girl had just felt her own death and only moaned. She was completely out of her mind. And the man had no choice but to shake her harder and shout sharply. Then the beautiful witch finally looked up at him. There was still boundless horror in her eyes, but she recognized him. Seeing that Vienna was beginning to come to her senses, the gentleman loosened his hands a little. After that, he allowed the girl to carefully lower herself onto the carpet. The Inquisitor asked her if she had seen any dreams. The girl barely audibly answered in the affirmative. Then Maclart asked her what exactly she had dreamed about. But Vienna didn't want to tell. She only let it slip that there was nothing special in the dream. Then her throat tightened with excitement. Vienna began to cough. Seeing this, the man decided to give her a little drink. Turning around, he saw a cup of water on the table and reached out his hand to it. Standing directly in front of Vienne, the Inquisitor handed her the cup. The man's face was impassive, but his eyes were gleaming with anxiety. He brought the cup closer to the beautiful witch, and she stretched out her hands to it. Her fingers trembled violently, and her voice was muffled and broken. The girl thanked the gentleman and took the cup. However, she could not hold it because of the trembling. The cup tilted dangerously. It almost fell from Vienna's weak fingers. However, at the last moment Macklart caught the vessel. The man put the cup back into her hands. However, he did not remove his own, holding the witch's trembling fingers. She reached for the water with dry lips. Blood was still trickling down her raised, shackled hands. Inquisitor Macklart looked at her carefully. There was a lot in his gaze: irritation, compassion, and concern. He suddenly removed his hands and moved away. Looking down, the man coldly remarked that she was too much trouble, and suddenly a key flashed in his hand. Vienna froze, afraid to believe her eyes, and suddenly Macklart unfastened the shackles from her hands and took them off. After that, he simply told her to finally drink some water. The girl looked up at him. She was still sitting right on the carpet, and the Inquisitor towered over her with all his power. Seeing her look, he very reservedly said that she shouldn't invent anything for herself. He was simply irritated by the endless clanging of the shackles. Vienna looked at him timidly. She was happy to be free of the hated shackles even for a little while, so she simply agreed. While she was drinking, the man stood opposite and watched. He was already in complete control of himself, so that nothing could be read on his face. The girl drank some water and sighed with relief. She felt much better and her cough subsided. Then the Inquisitor took the cup and put it on the table. He involuntarily noticed that small spots of blood were darkening on the rim. Turning back to the girl, he continued his questioning. Macklart needed to know what happened next. Guiltily lowering her eyes, Vienna replied that the wolf had come across a man in the forest and was about to attack him. However, he was stopped by a group of people. To this, Macklart noted that this wolf had already been seen very close to the castle. However, he was interested in the fact that people had made a camp at the edge of the forest. It was strange. But what seemed even stranger was that these were experienced hunters who killed the beast with one blow of a dagger. The girl's story did not inspire confidence in the Inquisitor. He decided that she was not worth trusting. The man turned away. But then the witch tried to grab him by the hem of his cloak and began to assure him that she was telling the truth. Seeing the gentleman's distrust, the girl tried to remember at least something else. Suddenly it dawned on her. The Inquisitor had already grabbed the door handle when Vienna screamed after him. She remembered that the people from the forest had strange black eyes. Macklart stopped. Without turning around, he asked again. The man wanted to make sure that he had really heard something about black eyes, and Vienna firmly replied that she remembered it very well. And it was not an accident at all. All those people she saw through the wolf's eyes in his last moments of life had very black eyes. That's why she remembered. Then the Inquisitor thought. The Great Witch had never left the lands of Temfei, which meant she could not know anything about the monster people of Ifon. The man approached Vienna again, who was sitting on the floor. She looked up at him submissively and a little frightened. Macklart looked at the cup again, his gaze once again caught by the bloody imprint on the rim. He was right where the witch's lips touched the vessel. The man slowly turned his gaze to the girl's face. She looked straight at him, tense and expectant. Her lips were slightly stained with blood. And then the Inquisitor felt that same sweetish smell again. This time it was so strong and dense that he wanted to taste it. Suddenly the man dropped to the floor right in front of the witch. He said that the girl had not lied and could indeed merge with an animal with her blood. Macklart held the cup with the bloody imprint of Vienna's lips in his hand and looked at it thoughtfully. Now he believed in the power of the witch's blood. The girl's heart sank from an incomprehensible anxiety and immediately began to beat twice as fast. Her eyes widened with an anxious premonition, and the Inquisitor, sitting opposite her on the carpet and holding a cup with traces of blood, looked straight at her. He wanted to know what could happen to a person. Vienna screamed and reached for the cup, and Macklart asked what would happen to him if he drank the blood of the Great Witch. The girl muttered something, stumbling and shaking. She was stylishly scared, and tears were running down her cheeks. Rushing towards the Inquisitor, Vienna tried to stop him, screaming that he would become a demon. Intercepting his hand with the cup, the girl repeated more quietly. According to her, a person who drank her blood would lose his mind and become a demon. Hearing this, the Inquisitor froze for a moment and immediately raised the cup higher. He was significantly taller than Vienna, even sitting on the floor. The girl reached out to him with her whole body, trying to get the cup. And then she ran into the gentleman's cold gaze. Now the beautiful witch was looking straight at him. The man felt something strange, as if a fragrant scarlet haze had enveloped him. The two were all alone in the large chambers, lit only by the fire in the fireplace. However, something invisible to the eye, magical, was in the air between them. It only lasted a few seconds before the Inquisitor shook off the spell. He coldly stated that he was not at all surprised. Now that he knew that witch's blood was poison to humans, he became even more stern. Straightening up, Macklart looked at the girl with condemnation. Nodding to some thoughts of his own, the man buttoned up his shirt collar and turned away. His thoughts were already somewhere far away. Taking a sword in its sheath from the table, the gentleman called out to the guard. He instructed the guard who came to the call to call Dr. Pepin. Vienna looked at him, frightened and sad. She didn't know what else the Inquisitor could have thought of. Seeing that the man was already heading for the exit, Vienna dared to address him. The girl said that the gentleman had seen the fusion process. This was why he kept the witch in his chambers. So now the girl could be returned to her room in the dungeon. But Macklart refused. Now Vienna seemed to him like a living container of poison, and that meant that letting her go would be simply dangerous. The girl lowered her head sadly. Immediately becoming sad, she quietly said that then the Inquisitor himself should stay away from her. She sank to the floor again. And then, seeing the unfastened shackles in front of her, she realized that the master had not put the shackles back on her. Vienna timidly reminded Inquisitor Macklart about the handcuffs. After all, according to the rules, she had to be in them at all times. The girl had already stretched out her hand to give the shackles to the master, but he offered her to keep them as a reward for her obedience. Seeing her surprised look, the man advised the beautiful witch not to think about stupid things and to enjoy even the little things. This was already a concession. Vienna thought she had misheard or misunderstood him. She hesitantly asked him what he meant. Apparently, Inquisitor Macklart was no longer going to put the shackles on her. The girl watched him go and felt a strange feeling. She recalled how everyone around her treated her with disgust and hostility. The guards avoided even the slightest touch. And then Vienna said sadly that she understood everything. Of course, Macklart considered her a second-class citizen, the scum of society. But at the same time, it was he who treated her best of all. The man was always the most humane and humane. Hearing this, the Inquisitor froze without turning around. And then the voice of Dr. Pepin was heard from the corridor. The doctor opened the door and walked in. He quickly apologized for being late, but Macklart walked past him silently as if he hadn't noticed the newcomer. The door closed behind him. Now in the chambers were only the young witch and Dr. Pepin, frozen in surprise. The man sniffed and declared that the aura in the chambers was simply murderous. Then he began to ask discontentedly what the witch had done. The girl didn't know what to answer. And Dr. Pepin said that the gentleman was clearly angry, so the reason was only in her. Vienna began to assure the doctor that she had done nothing of the sort. The girl really did not know the reason for her master's anger. But the doctor could not guess anything either. At that very moment, Inquisitor Macklart went to his office. The commander of the guards was already waiting for him there. He reported to the master that traces of a camp that had been abandoned in a hurry had been discovered near the castle. The guards had already set dogs on the trail. The Inquisitor thought about it. Few would dare to set up camp near his castle. The commander, seeing his thoughtfulness, suggested sending more soldiers. However, Macklart replied that he would go in pursuit himself. He was the master of his land and had to find out for himself who dared to violate his property. The commander of the guards bowed humbly. The warriors knew their business well, and they knew who they were subordinate to. Therefore, no one would argue with the master. Finally, the visitor left, leaving the Inquisitor alone. The slamming of the door again awakened memories. Macklart couldn't help but hear Vienna's voice when she remarked on his humanity. The man wasn't too pleased with himself. He knew that his rank and position obliged him to do many things, and he simply had no right to expose himself to doubts and weaknesses. The man remembered standing before the great priest during his initiation, who had told Macklart to always be cool and remember his duty. The priests always noted his extraordinary abilities. No one doubted that the Inquisitor was truly filled with divine power. However, many understood that it was extremely difficult for the human subconscious to cope with such a load. Therefore, constant control was needed, and Inquisitor Macklart learned to control himself very well. One of the ways was regular blows of the whip. While being lashed, he kept repeating that he existed only to serve God. The pain prevented him from rising and brought him back to humility. Macklart was diligent in everything and always. The same was true for the whipping. The result was a multitude of scars that crisscrossed the master's back. Thanks to this, the Inquisitor had been in constant control of himself for many years. And now, fighting with the captured monstermen, he was unperturbed. Finally, it was all over. The bodies of the fallen enemies covered the ground like a bloody carpet. Macklart lowered his sword and exhaled wearily. Suddenly he thought that the blood had a completely nauseating smell. However, the man had never paid attention to this before. It seemed that something had changed in him just now, and the appearance of the beautiful witch was clearly somehow connected with this. The Inquisitor involuntarily recalled her bloody lips, and the numerous wounds, fresh and old, that covered her tender body. These strange thoughts were suddenly interrupted by the guard commander. The warrior reported that the squad had eliminated all the remaining monsters on the other side. It remained to decide what to do with the corpses of the enemies. Maclart ordered their heads to be hung on the fortress wall. All the witches caught in the Glada Gorge were also to be sent there. The Inquisitor had no pity for them. After completing the campaign, the detachment returned to the castle. The soft setting sun painted its walls golden pink. Not noticing the beauty surrounding him, the Inquisitor headed towards the castle gates. And suddenly he saw a man in front of him. He greeted him affably. They hadn't seen each other for quite some time, but Maclart didn't show any particular joy at the meeting. The man in the snow-white robe lifted the veil covering his head and smiled. It was the great priest. The Inquisitor showed no sign of displeasure. His gloved hand only clenched into a fist. The visit of the great priest was most inopportune. Nevertheless, the man dropped to one knee and pressed his lips to the priest's hand. The priest looked at the Inquisitor tenderly. At the same time, in the Inquisitor's chambers, Vienna was sitting on the carpet by the fireplace. She put her hands closer to the fire, enjoying its warmth. The girl looked thoughtfully at her scars and thought. She hoped that if she behaved correctly, then everything could work out, and then perhaps she would have managed to escape. However, suddenly an inexplicable feeling of anxiety appeared in her soul. Hearing a sharp sound, the witch looked out the window. There, high in the sky, huge black birds were circling. Their cries sent shivers down her spine. 2 guards accompanied the great witch. Today, on the occasion of the meeting with the high priest, the girl was dressed in an expensive dress of scarlet velvet. But having dressed her in expensive clothes did not suddenly begin to treat her differently. They hurried her along the way, and when they got to the door, they roughly pushed her into the chambers. The high priest and Inquisitor Maclart were just talking about her. The face of the honored guest from the capital expressed amazement at the sight of the pretty witch. The priest came up from behind and pressed on the back of the captive's head. He ordered her to show respect to the great priest. Having overcome the resistance, the man forcibly lowered Vienne's head to the floor face down. The girl screamed. The high priest ordered not to press her so hard. He quoted that the Lord God was merciful to all who repent. The witch looked up at the handsome stranger with her amazing red eyes, confused. The priest approached the girl. Sitting down next to her, he began to examine her closely. He was surprised that she was bleeding and reached out to the witch's face. But Maclart grabbed her wrist in time, warned her of the danger. The priests were watching the scene from a distance and considered such behavior inappropriate. The priest assured him that he was very touched by how much Maclart cared for him, but he asked him not to do that again, and he stepped away from him. The guest said that he wanted for the common good to take a good look at this witch. Maclart frowned, wondering what the priest meant by look closely. He replied that he wanted to talk to the witch face to face, and asked to free up a room for this, and also to prepare something to eat. Vienna was still sitting on the floor, her red eyes pleading with Maclart, silently asking him not to leave her alone with the stranger. The owner of these lands flashed his blue eyes. He firmly declared that he would stay with them. The priest was surprised. He called out Merklat's name with a note of reproach. He asked not to force him to repeat it twice. The Inquisitor remembered the face of the great priest many years ago. It was he who had beaten him with whips, repeating that he existed only for God. And the priest was already leaving the room, and he called the witch to follow him. The guard brought up the rear. Vienna turned around and looked at the gentleman with a hunted look. He stood nearby, clenching his fists tightly in an attempt to restrain himself. Soon the great priest and the great witch were sitting at a long table laden with exquisite dishes. The girl took advantage of the opportunity to eat normal food for a long time during her imprisonment. Choking, she began to cough. The priest assumed that it was difficult to eat in his presence, and he handed her a glass filled with red wine. Vienna was timid, but the man insisted. The young witch carefully sipped the grape drink, but she was ordered to drink it to the bottom. Soon the glass was empty. Vienne's vision began to swim, and her head began to spin. The high priest, watching the young girl, chuckled. He said that sometimes hops help to get rid of unnecessary excitement. The man asked in a sweet, ingratiating voice. Was the interlocutor now ready to answer the questions of a high-ranking person? The girl did not understand what the priest was leading all this to, and he first asked how her hand was and whether it had recovered from the bite. Vienna remembered those 2 wolves. She shuddered from the terrible visions. Stuttering slightly, she answered affirmatively. The man assumed that the witch could have gotten used to this by now. After all, upon arrival, her body was covered with numerous bite marks. Vienna was thinking about her own. She wondered how much was known to the high priest. The girl understood that Dr. Pepin was examining her. But what was more important was how much Maclart, who knew about the response, had said in his report. The young witch replied that these were merely traces of devil worship. The priest said that there was no need to try to hide them. He assured that God was magnanimous, and that he granted the path to salvation to those who came with repentance. But Vienna said that her recent answer was all she could say. The high priest groaned heavily and long. The distinguished guest said he was disappointed. He stated that he knew how she communicated with animals through blood. The young witch screamed that it was a force sent by the devil, but the priest insisted that it was not so important who gave the force. What was important was for what purposes it was used. He offered to kneel before him, promising that this would put an end to all her suffering. He said that at her request he could even order the witch hunt to be stopped. The girl couldn't believe her ears and even asked again. The priest confirmed his firm intention to spare the supreme witch and all her fellow tribeswomen. The pupils of the unique red eyes narrowed. Through carelessness, Vienne knocked over a glass. It fell with a clang and broke into pieces. The high priest asked with emphasis in his voice whether the witch would swear to use her power only at his command.